The year is 1939. Europe, a continent still scarred by the previous great conflict, held its breath. The fragile peace brokered 2 decades earlier was shattered by the ambitions of one man and the swift, brutal efficiency of his war machine. The battle for Europe, World War II, had begun. Part 1. Blitzkrieg and the Fall of the West, 1939-1940. The conflict ignited not with a bang, but with a blitzkrieg, lightning war. On September 1, 1939, German tanks and infantry poured across the border into Poland. This was a new kind of warfare, highly mechanized, coordinated by radio, and focused on deep penetration, bypassing traditional front lines. Poland, despite fighting bravely, was crushed within weeks, partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under the terms of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For months, a phony war settled over Western Europe, but the calm was the prelude to the storm. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway to secure iron ore routes and naval bases. Then in May, the full fury of the Blitzkrieg turned on the West. The Allies were prepared for a repeat of World War I trench warfare. Instead, German General Erich von Manstein's audacious plan sent fast-moving panzer divisions through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, bypassing the formidable French Maginot Line. They struck at the weakest point of the Allied defenses, achieving a rapid breakout and racing toward the English Channel. Within days, Allied forces, British, French, and Belgian, were encircled in a small pocket around the port of Dunkirk. What followed was a miracle of improvisation and resolve, Operation Dynamo. Hundreds of civilian boats, from fishing trawlers to pleasure yachts, joined naval vessels in a desperate 9-day effort to evacuate the trapped soldiers. Over 338,000 men were rescued, preserving the core of the British Army, although all their heavy equipment was lost. France, demoralized and militarily broken, signed an armistice on June 22, 1940. Hitler's vision of a continent under Nazi control seemed terrifyingly close to reality. Part 2. Britain stands alone and the Eastern Inferno, 1940-1941. With France gone, only Britain remained. The invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was planned, but first the Luftwaffe had to achieve air superiority over the English Channel. From July to October 1940, the skies over Britain became the battlefield for the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces. The Royal Air Force, RAF, heavily outnumbered, fought a masterful defensive battle, utilizing the then novel technology of radar and a highly efficient ground control system to vector fighter squadrons to intercept the German raids. The sacrifices of the British and Allied pilots, immortalized by Churchill as the few, prevented the invasion. Germany failed to break the RAF, forcing Hitler to indefinitely postpone Sea Lion, a critical strategic failure. Frustrated in the West, Hitler turned his gaze east, toward the vast, resource-rich lands of the Soviet Union, fulfilling his long-held ideological goal of Lebensraum, living space. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, was launched. 3 massive German army groups drove deep into Soviet territory, initially achieving stunning success against the unprepared Red Army, capturing millions of prisoners and advancing hundreds of miles. The Soviet Union, a vast totalitarian state itself, reeled under the shock. Entire cities became symbols of brutal resistance and suffering. The Siege of Leningrad began, one of the deadliest sieges in history, lasting 872 days and starving nearly 1 million civilians to death. But the German advance was not unstoppable. Distance, poor roads, and the enormous scale of Soviet manpower and resources began to take their toll. General Winter, the historical ally of Russia, arrived early and bit deep, freezing German lubricants, vehicles, and soldiers who were still in summer uniforms. By December 21, 1941, the German advance on Moscow was halted by a massive Soviet counteroffensive, led in part by General Georgy Zhukov. The swift blitzkrieg model had failed in the endless expanse of the East. The war of quick victory had become a war of attrition, one that Hitler's Germany was ill-equipped to win. Part 3. The Tide Turns. Stalingrad and El Alamein, 1942-1943. By 1942, the war had truly become global, with the United States entering the conflict after the attack on Pearl Harbor, immediately adopting a Germany First strategy. The Allied strategy coalesced around two primary objectives: keeping the supply lines open via the Battle of the Atlantic, and striking at the Axis perimeter before a full-scale invasion of Europe could be mounted. The most critical and devastating battle of this period took place on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, German forces launched a major offensive toward the city on the Volga River, a vital industrial and symbolic target. The fighting devolved into unimaginable, brutal urban combat, a rat war of snipers, house-to-house fighting, and relentless close-quarters butchery. Stalin ordered his troops not a step back. The Soviet 62nd Army under Vasily Chukoev held the line. The turning point came when the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army. Trapped and facing starvation in the Soviet winter, Hitler refused to allow a retreat, a fatal strategic error. In February 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered. The loss of nearly 300,000 Axis troops, German, Romanian, Italian, was catastrophic. Stalingrad was the death blow to the Wehrmacht's offensive capability in the East. From this point on, the Soviet war machine would begin its inexorable march toward Berlin. Meanwhile, there was a turning point occurring in North Africa. Control of the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil was critical. The British Eighth Army under the newly appointed General Bernard Montgomery clashed with Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. A decisive victory coupled with the Operation Torch Anglo-American landings in Morocco and Algeria trapped the Axis forces. North Africa was cleared of Axis troops by May 1943, opening the door for the first Allied landings on the European mainland. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily, Operation Husky, followed by the invasion of mainland Italy in September. Mussolini was overthrown and Italy formally surrendered, though heavy fighting against German forces continued for 2 more years. This soft underbelly strategy forced Germany to divert troops from the Eastern Front, providing critical relief for the Soviets, a core element of the Allied coalition strategy. The culmination of the German offensive efforts came at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. The Soviets successfully blunted the German attack, exhausting the last of the Wehrmacht's armored reserves and cementing the Red Army's dominance in the East. Part 4. The Global War Economy and the Resistance. Victory was not solely determined by battles on the front lines. Behind the fighting, a vast total war economy was mobilized. The United States, untouched by the fighting at home, became the arsenal of democracy. The Lend-Lease Act provided billions of dollars in war materials, food, and oil to the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and other allied nations, proving an essential lifeline. American industrial output, tanks, planes, ships, quickly dwarfed that of the Axis powers, shifting the fundamental balance of power. The strategic air war also took its toll. Day and night, the Allied bombers struck at German industrial centers, oil refineries, and transport hubs. Though controversial for the high civilian casualties, the bombing campaign severely restricted the German war machine and, critically, forced the Luftwaffe to dedicate its best fighter units to Reich defense, keeping them out of action on the eastern and western fronts.
Within occupied Europe, the flame of defiance was kept alive by countless acts of resistance. partisan groups, ranging from sophisticated intelligence networks to armed guerrillas, sabotaged German operations, provided vital intelligence to the Allies, and organized escapes for downed airmen. In Poland, the Home Army maintained a veritable underground state. In France, the Maquis prepared to rise. These actions, often undertaken at unimaginable personal risk, tied down German occupation forces and prevented the wholesale plunder of resources. Tragically, this period also saw the peak of the Holocaust, the state-sponsored systematic persecution and murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, including Roma, disabled people, and political dissidents by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. The strategies for victory were inextricably linked to the moral imperative of defeating the ultimate evil of the 20th century. Part 5. D-Day and the Two-Front Squeeze, 1944. Stalin had long demanded a second front in the West to alleviate the pressure on the Red Army. That front arrived on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Battle of Normandy. Operation Overlord was the largest amphibious assault in history. It required years of meticulous planning, a massive build-up of men and materiel in Britain, and a complex deception plan, Operation Fortitude, to mislead the Germans into believing the invasion would occur at Calais. On the morning of D-Day, 156,000 American, British, and Canadian troops landed on 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The landings were met with fierce resistance, particularly at Omaha Beach, but the foothold was secured. The strategy was to build up forces rapidly and break out of the Normandy perimeter. The fighting in the dense bocage of hedgerows in Normandy was slow and costly, but a massive American breakout, Operation Cobra, finally shattered the German lines in late July. The Allies poured into France. The German 7th Army was encircled and largely destroyed in the Falaise pocket. Paris was liberated in August. The advance was so rapid that it created a logistical nightmare, stretching supply lines all the way back to the Normandy beaches. The Allied commanders, notably General George S. Patton and Field Marshal Montgomery, engaged in a fierce debate over strategy: a narrow thrust into Germany or a broad front advance. The attempt to seize a quick victory came in September with Operation Martin Garden, a daring airborne assault into the Netherlands designed to bypass the Siegfried Line and seize a bridgehead over the Rhine. It was a bridge too far, a failure of intelligence, weather, and execution, and the Allies were forced to a halt, facing the fortified German border. Simultaneously, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration in June 1944. This Soviet offensive shattered the German Army Group's center, killing or capturing an estimated 400,000 German soldiers. The Soviets drove deep into Poland and the Balkans, a move far larger and more devastating than D-Day. Germany was now caught in the vice of a true two-front war, squeezed from both east and west. Part 6. The Final Gambit and the Road to Berlin, 1944-1945. The pressure on Hitler mounted. Facing a desperate situation, he poured his last reserves of men and armor into a massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes forest in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive on the Western Front. It caught the American forces by surprise, creating a deep bulge in the Allied line. The fighting was brutal and cold, but American resolve held, particularly at the encircled town of Bastogne. When General Anthony McAuliffe was asked by the Germans to surrender, he famously replied, "Nuts." Once the skies cleared, Allied air power devastated the German columns, and counterattacks from Generals Patton and Montgomery crushed the offensive. The battle was a costly American victory, but it exhausted the Wehrmacht's last major fighting capability on the Western Front. With the Ardennes offensive crushed, the Allied armies crossed the Rhine River in early 1945. The Western Allies began their final push into the heart of Germany. Meanwhile, the Red Army closed in from the east. The Soviet advance was relentless, driven by a fierce desire for revenge for the atrocities emitted on their soil, culminating in the Vistula-Oder offensive, which brought them to the gates of Berlin. The final chapter began with the Battle of Berlin in April 1945. Surrounded and utterly destroyed by a massive Soviet assault, the remnants of the German capital became a cauldron of desperate final fighting by German regular army units, Waffen-SS fanatics, and ill-equipped boys and old men of the Volkssturm. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30, 1945. On May 7, 1945, at Reims, France, German representatives signed the unconditional surrender to the Western Allies. On May 8, a similar document was signed in Berlin before the Soviet High Command. The war in Europe was over. VE Day. Victory in Europe. The cost of this victory defies comprehension. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, claiming an estimated 39 million lives in Europe alone, a majority of whom were civilians. The Soviet Union bore the most colossal burden, losing over 20 million citizens, soldiers, and civilians, more than all other Allied nations combined. Their sacrifice on the Eastern Front, where 80% of German ground forces were engaged, was the principal catalyst for the defeat of the Wehrmacht. Poland, invaded and occupied by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, lost roughly 1/5 of its population, enduring the most systematic destruction and mass murder by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. The Holocaust left an indelible moral scar. The concentration camps and killing centers, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, were liberated, revealing the full, horrifying extent of the Nazi genocide. The world was forced to confront the abyss. Cities across the continent lay in ruins: Berlin, Warsaw, London, Stalingrad, Dresden. Millions were displaced, refugees, ex-prisoners of war, survivors of the camps, scrambling to find food, family, and a home in a landscape of rubble. The financial and industrial infrastructure of Europe was devastated. Yet from the ashes, a new, fractured Europe emerged. The wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union quickly dissolved. The Iron Curtain descended, dividing the continent between the democratic US-backed West and the communist Soviet-controlled East, ushering in the Cold War. The strategies and the immense sacrifices made, from the pilots in the Battle of Britain to the exhausted infantrymen at Stalingrad, from the commandos of D-Day to the partisans in the forests, had achieved the impossible, the defeat of Nazi tyranny. Their victory preserved the dream of freedom, but it came at a price that Europe would spend decades paying. The battle for Europe was won, but the shape of the post-war world had only just begun to take form. The war had not merely ended, it had fundamentally reshaped the course of human history.